Our first speaker today is FARRELL O'GORMAN. He's professor of English at Belmont Abbey College. He's the author of Peculiar Crossroads, Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, and Catholic Vision in Postwar Southern Fiction from LSU Press in 2004. He graduated from Notre Dame's Great Book programs in 1990, then served 4 years on U.S. Navy ships before completing doctoral study at a small southern UNC or so. Completing his degree here at UNC. He served as assistant professor of English at Mississippi State University and associate professor of Catholic Studies and Literature at DePaul University before going to Belmont Abbey this year. He's previously lectured on O'Connor and others, and Percy in France, Italy, and a summer institute at Andalusia, Flannery O'Connor's Georgia hometown, the conference sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities. He has himself published a novel a few years ago, as well as some short stories and personal essays, including one on how to be an American in spite of being Southern and Catholic. So that's an intriguing title that I'm sure you'll run out and Google and try to get your hands on. It was selected as for the collection Best Catholic Writing in 2007. So we welcome FARRELL as our lead-off speaker today.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. I'd like to thank Chris, Jeremy, the Thomas Center for organizing this event and for inviting me here. It's always good to be back in Chapel Hill, where I spent a lot of time in Greenlaw Hall, right over there. Do we have any English majors? Just curious. We've got some English majors out here. That's good. I'd also like to say hello to my father-in-law and mother-in-law, Linda and Jerry Fulda, who are in the audience here, and to thank all of you for coming out this morning. So my title is Introducing Walker Percy, the Moviegoer. In a number of his essays, Walker Percy notes that people often discover great literature not in school, but in spite of school. Since I'm a teacher of literature myself, I hope this is not always the case. But I have to admit that my own discovery of Percy himself falls into the pattern just described, or at least partly so. And I think an appropriate way to begin might be to tell you a little bit about that discovery, because Percy himself was very much aware of the particularity of the manner in which the individual reader comes to a book, even of the physicality of the experience, which for all its apparently intellectual nature, remains firmly grounded in place and time. In one of his lesser-known essays, Percy pondered, quote, the mysterious connection between the words that flow from the writer's mind and the thing in the reader's hand. There is a connection. How can I not connect Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov, with the big fat Random House edition? Fat as a Bible, its pages slightly pulpy, crumbling at the corners and smelling like bread. Is this bad? And how can I disconnect the characters of Ivan and Mitya Karamazov from reading about them sitting on a swing on my grandmother's porch in Athens, Georgia in the 1930s? Should I? End quote. When I first came across Walker Percy, I was on the verge of reading The Brothers Karamazov for the first time myself. I'm a native of South Carolina. I was living away from home, a junior in college at the University of Notre Dame, majoring in a great books program where the ongoing seminar at the heart of the curriculum had begun with Homer and Herodotus and wasn't scheduled to reach the 20th century until my senior year. I was receiving a great education and one not primarily literary. We read Aristotle and Descartes and Darwin, and because I was at Notre Dame, a lot of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, along with our Dante and Jane Austen. I wouldn't have traded it and still wouldn't trade it for anything, but some things still seemed missing. In the broad view of Western civilization we were receiving, America was hardly a blip on the radar screen. By the time we were done, we would get to Walden and Moby Dick and the Federalist Papers, and a few Europeans who took America as their subject. We would read two American philosophers who seemed quite obscure to me at the time, William James, whose brother Henry I had some inkling about, and one other who seemed particularly difficult, the pragmatist and early semiotic theorist Charles Sanders Peirce. Finally, we would read one last American writer whose world was fundamentally more difficult than mine, but who in some respects seemed closer to me than anyone we had read in the program. That was Ralph Ellison, the author of Invisible Man, whose parents were Southern African Americans. But in the winter of 1988, we'd not gotten to those writers yet, and I was on Christmas break looking for something to read. I was in a small bookstore in my suburban hometown outside Columbia, South Carolina, and browsing through not the fiction section, but the literature section, as bookstores label these things. Somewhere between Poe and Pasternak, my eyes fell on Percy, Walker Percy. Interesting name. Which one went first? It wasn't Percy Walker, was it? Or Walter Percy? No, I'd gotten it right the first time. There was a whole line of novels wrapped in bright pastel and white covers. The one I picked up was Love in the Ruins. The front cover featured a sketch of a rumpled-looking gentleman wearing black suspenders and a white Panama hat and holding some kind of cocktail. The back cover promised a satirical look at contemporary man in an irrationally polarized society. The author, it turned out, was an MD who lived in Louisiana, which wasn't my side of the South, but seemed a lot closer to home than Goethe or Voltaire or Thoreau, for that matter. I flipped through the first few pages of the book, where I found the narrator offering a kind of lukewarm religious testimonial that concluded with this confession, quote, "I believe in God and the whole business, but I love women best, music and science next, whiskey next, God fourth, and my fellow man, hardly at all," end quote. This seemed to me like a book worth reading. I bought it, and by the time I got halfway through Love in the Ruins and heard the psychiatrist narrator citing Pascal and worrying about the Cartesian mind-body split in between drinking gin fizzes and pursuing affairs with 3 different women, I had some inkling that, though I had not discovered Walker Percy in school, much of what I had read in school had been preparing me to discover him. For it turned out to be altogether appropriate that I first read Percy in the middle of reading Dostoevsky and Freud and Ellison. Much as I valued Percy for writing about my contemporary America and my contemporary South, I saw from the start that he did so with a sweeping knowledge of the tradition in which I was being educated, a knowledge of not only its literature, but also its philosophy, its theology, and perhaps most astoundingly, its science. I could tell you more about where I first read Love in the Ruins, where I first read each of Percy's novels, in the way I think many of us remember our most formative experiences as readers. But suffice it to say that Percy moved me enough to undertake a senior thesis on his work, and in many ways was primarily responsible for my eventual return to graduate study in English. And still today, Walker Percy remains for me unsurpassed as a thinker who presents us with a valuable, coherent perspective, both on our nature as human beings and on some of the ways in which we tend to lose sight of that nature in contemporary American culture. In the second part of my talk, I'm going to focus on Percy's first novel, The Moviegoer, emphasizing how Percy's broad intellectual interest enabled him in that novel to break from earlier patterns in 20th century Southern literature. But in preparation for that, I should make some other remarks that speak generally to the richness and depth of Percy's novels and essays, a body of work that has drawn the admiration of not only literary scholars, but experts from other fields of study as well. Percy's biography partly explains the range of his interest and the structure of his work. Born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1916, he was the descendant of a family long prominent in the Western South, though intermittently troubled nonetheless. When Percy was only 11, his own wealthy and successful father committed suicide. His teenage years were primarily spent in Greenville, Mississippi, where he was raised by his distinguished uncle, William Alexander Percy, a lawyer, planter, and poet who raised Walker with a radical skepticism towards Christianity, but a strong moral sense nonetheless, a kind of noblesse oblige, a belief in the patrician values long put into practice by the Percy family, particularly in their public defense of African Americans against the race-baiting demagogues, mostly poorer whites, who arose in Mississippi after Reconstruction. Uncle Will, who raised Percy after age 13, Uncle Will, in many ways a late Victorian, was a graduate of the University of the South and of Harvard Law School. But Walker chose to come here to UNC, and here he settled on a major as an undergraduate that marked him as a man of the 20th century, chemistry. At this stage of his life, literature, like the movies that Percy regularly attended in Chapel Hill, seemed largely a diversion from the realities of the world, realities which he had come to believe could only be understood beneath a microscope. In 1937, Percy left Chapel Hill for medical school at Columbia University in New York, where he developed a keen interest in psychiatry and underwent psychoanalysis himself for several years in preparation for possible specialization in that field. But he finally chose a residency at the opposite end of the medical spectrum, pathology. And this work changed his life in 1941. Assigned to work with tuberculosis victims, Percy soon contracted pulmonary tuberculosis himself. He found himself infected, he later wrote, with, quote, one of those elegant agents of disease that I used to see lying crisscrossed like Chinese characters in the sputum and lymphoid tissue of the patients at Bellevue. Now I was one of them, end quote. Percy spent the next several years recovering at sanatoriums in upstate New York and Connecticut, and while there began to read in earnest the authors who challenged his understanding of the world, the French existentialist writers who were so prominent in mid-century, but also their predecessors Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard, as well as contemporary theologians and Christian philosophers such as Jacques Maritain. Percy would later credit this period of confinement as the most fortunate time of his life, indeed as crucially enabling him to choose that life, because he was forced to confront new questions. Quote, did my eyes deceive me, or was there not a huge gap in the scientific view of the world, scientific in the root sense of the word, knowing? If so, it was an oversight which everyone pretended not to notice, or maybe didn't want to notice. After 12 years of a scientific education, I felt that everything under the sun had been explained to me except one small detail, what it means to be a man living in the world who must die, end quote. After recovering from tuberculosis, Percy at age 30 decided to return to the South, propose marriage to Mary Bernice Townsend, commit himself to writing rather than medicine, and enter the Catholic Church. Over the next decade, he wrote 2 novels, which he failed to publish, then spent years publishing articles in philosophy journals, developing an interest in the philosophy of language and semiotics, or theory of signs. In 1960, The Moviegoer, his first novel, was accepted for publication, and when it won the National Book Award shortly thereafter, his reputation as a novelist was secured. Percy's background and breadth helped to explain the variety of scholars who've taken an interest in his work. As part of the Percy clan, he has figured in such works, historical works, as James Cobbs's History of the Mississippi Delta, entitled The Most Southern Place on Earth. Another historian of the South, Bertram Wyatt Brown, made Walker's ancestral clan the subject of an entire book. The House of Percy, Honor, Melancholy, and Imagination in a Southern Family suggests that the Percys of Mississippi played a role in their own region comparable to that which the 19th century Adamses of Massachusetts played in the nation as a whole. Here and elsewhere, Wyatt Brown relies upon the history and writings of the Percy family in his study of the Southern conception of honor that he finds so well exemplified there. And Wyatt Brown rightly calls Walker Percy the last major American writer to make honor a serious concern in his work. This aspect of Percy's life is certainly crucial to any consideration of him as a Southern novelist. But another vital book on Percy makes little mention of his regional identity at all. The book, The Last Physician, Walker Percy and the Moral Life of Medicine, is concerned with Percy's identities as physician novelist, as patient novelist, and as a moralist profoundly concerned with the choices that advances in the medical sciences present to our society. The 2 editors of this book are accomplished physicians and bioethicists who see Percy's essays and novels as vital components of a contemporary education in the medical humanities. Unfortunately, the editors also tend to agree that some of Percy's worst fears may be coming true, particularly in psychiatry. For all his differences with Freud, Percy admired the founder of modern psychoanalysis for being, despite himself, an old-time doctor of the soul, for believing that many patients with mental health problems could be usefully treated in large part through talk, communication, words. Consequently, Percy feared the rise of brain engineers, that's his term, who would give up on the psyche altogether and opt only for brain chemistry. In an essay entitled Prozac and the Existential Novel, one of the editors of the book that I just mentioned, bioethicist Dr. Carl Elliott, expounds upon Percy's own ideas about the novel of alienation, allying the fiction writer with the psychoanalyst or doctor of the soul. So this is a quote from Elliott, the bioethicist who's writing about Percy's views. So Elliott writes, quote, "There is a radical difference between the way the novelist looks at the man who feels bad and doesn't know why, and the way medicine ordinarily does. Henderson the Rain King is going to look very different in the pages of Saul Bellow's novel than he would in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases. The difference is this: the medical standpoint looks at the man who feels bad and doesn't know why and says, this fellow is in bad shape. What he needs is to develop his self-esteem, maybe develop a meaningful relationship, and above all, get on a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Whereas the novel can say, of course you're lonely and alienated and filled with terror and anxiety. Take a look around you. It would take a moron not to be. What is going on in such a novel is what Percy calls the reversal of alienation by art, which is not exactly a cure for the alienated reader, but a way of identifying alienation and thereby turning it around. This aspect of Percy's work also marks him as perhaps the first and foremost American author of what I'm tempted to call the novel of pharmacological dystopia. Percy's satirical take on the potentially dangerous promise of late 20th century psychiatry preceded that of authors such as Don DeLillo, whose 1985 novel, White Noise, features Dilar, a drug that removes the fear of death. And Jonathan Franzen, whose 2001 novel, The Corrections, is partly concerned with the subtle proliferation of a psychiatric drug named Aslan, like C.S. Lewis's lion Christ figure, a drug that is designed to correct human imperfections and restlessness once and for all. Percy's position on such medical questions is ultimately related to his thoughts about language, because he believes that an adequate account of language, and therefore of consciousness itself, is what is most fundamentally missing in the contemporary scientific picture of the human being. In his essays on language, Percy draws on the work of the philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, similar sounding names, as he distinguishes between dyadic events and triadic events. I'm quoting freely from Percy's essays here. Dyadic events are the familiar subject matter of the physical and biological sciences, and involve a mutual interaction between two things: molecules interacting with other molecules, a billiard ball hitting another billiard ball, an organism responding to a stimulus. Triadic events, however, language and other forms of signing behavior, necessarily involve three elements and seem to occur only in human activity. When a human being names something and thereby links sound or sign and object, a triadic event occurs in which the human being himself or herself is the third element. And Percy follows the lead of Peirce in asserting that the essence of this third element is both real and non-material, a fact which, Percy argues, is, quote, of critical importance to natural science because its claim to reality is grounded not on any particular theology or metaphysic, but on empirical observation and the necessities of scientific logic, end quote. In a nutshell, Percy suggests that the observable fact that we use language and signs in the incredibly complex and apparently unique way that we do is evidence that we have souls. Percy's thoughts on science, literature, and language all converge on one central point. The human being is not merely an organism seeking to prosper in an environment. Rather, To be human is to be a self on pilgrimage in a world in which the human, unlike the animal, is free to choose to live authentically or inauthentically, to practice authentic speech and seek true understanding, or lapse into false speech and idle curiosity. But in contemporary American society, Percy well knew, a radical faith in the physical sciences as the primary domain of the real, along with a consumer economy fueled by constant technological advances, makes it all too easy for us to become blind to what we are. All this prepares us to encounter the moviegoer, which is both a novel of ideas and a particular kind of Southern novel. It is not primarily concerned with the way the past continually impacts the present in a traditional community, which was the great theme of William Faulkner, Catherine Ann Porter, Robert Penn Warren, and other Southern writers prominent earlier in the century. Rather, the moviegoer is a novel concerned with an alienated individual looking for meaning in a changing South that, in the 1950s, already seems immersed in the ever-expanding consumerism and technology of the post-World War II United States. I'll say more about the Southern aspects of the novel as we go, but consideration of one last philosopher will actually help us to get there. The novel opens with an epigraph from Soren Kierkegaard, and some understanding of his notion of the three spheres of existence will help us to understand the predicament of the moviegoer's narrator, Binks Bowling. The process by which an individual becomes a self is described by Kierkegaard as ideally moving through three stages. Since human development occurs by freedom and not automatically, however, the stages continually confront the individual as rival views of life. These three spheres of existence are the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. The aesthetic life is governed by the satisfaction of immediate desires for one's own pleasure, though it is capable of a kind of development in which one learns to enjoy life reflectively, as in the arts, or perhaps even through the construction of a kind of pleasingly coherent scientific vision of the world. In the ethical life, by contrast, one attempts to achieve a unified self through active commitment to ideals that are perceived as having enduring validity rather than simple momentary appeal. The religious life differs from the ethical in that the individual realizes both the transcendent character of the true ideals and also how far short of realizing those ideals the individual inevitably is. For Kierkegaard, such an understanding is necessitated particularly in acceptance of the revealed religion of Judaism and Christianity rather than the natural religion of Greek philosophy. Throughout most of the moviegoer, Binks dwells in the aesthetic sphere, living according to the values encouraged by the newly prosperous society in which he has immersed himself. But from the very beginning, he wryly acknowledges the limitations of such a life and embarks on a search. The ethical sphere in the novel is represented by Binks's Aunt Emily, who encourages her nephew to embrace not the new culture of post-war America, but an older Southern ethos. The superficially charming but finally stark code of manners and honor held by their aristocratic forebears. To Binks, however, such an ethos no longer seems viable, and he is left to stumble towards an understated entry into the religious sphere that he, with the help of his step-cousin Kate, approaches at the end of the novel. Binks does so, however, while largely avoiding a Christian vocabulary, because in the 20th century, as Percy wrote elsewhere, that vocabulary had become seemingly, quote, worn out. The old words of grace worn smooth as poker chips, having somehow undergone a devaluation, like a poker chip after it has been cashed in, end quote. From the start, Binks Bowling is clearly a new man of sorts. He is heir to an aristocratic family, but radically detached from their values. Though the Bowlings have their roots in rural Feliciana Parish, Binks, upon returning from the Korean conflict, has settled neither there nor in the New Orleans Garden District home where his aunt attempts to maintain the family heritage. Binks chooses instead Gentilly, quote, a middle-class suburb of New Orleans, which one would never guess was part of New Orleans, end quote. Binks actually prefers its anonymity to the old-world atmosphere of the French Quarter or the genteel charm of the Garden District, as he puts it. So Binks's family's traditional world does still exist, maybe primarily as a tourist attraction, but Binks elects to leave it and dwell instead on a street lined with, quote, shopping centers and blocks of duplexes and bungalows and raised cottages, end quote. In his suburb, Binks never thinks of himself as heir to an old aristocratic family, but rather as, quote, a model tenant and a model citizen, a veteran with all his papers in order, end quote. He forthrightly posits that his identity is bound by the terms of American culture during the early Cold War era, though he does so in a voice that is educated, self-aware, and ironic. So here's Binks speaking, quote, "It is a pleasure to carry out the duties of a citizen and to receive in return a receipt or a neat styrene card with one's name on it, certifying, so to speak, one's right to exist. What satisfaction I take in appearing the first day to get my auto tag and brake sticker. I subscribe to Consumer Reports, and as a consequence, I own a first-class television set, an all but silent air conditioner, and a very long-lasting deodorant. My armpits never stink," end quote. But even though he seems canny about the limitations of the culture he associates himself with here, Binks essentially lives on its terms. His sole discernible talent, he says, is, quote, the trick of making money as a small-time stockbroker, a profession in which he also excels at seducing his secretaries. His leisure time is largely spent, of course, going to the movies. His habit is introduced immediately after his discussion of his identity as a citizen consumer. Quote, "In the evenings, I usually watch television or go to the movies. Our neighborhood theater has permanent lettering on the front of the marquee reading, 'Where happiness costs so little,'" end quote. Indeed, Binks's New Orleans, Binks's America, is dominated by Hollywood to such an extent that celebrities and media-generated images have begun to seem somehow more real than reality itself. Binks later observes the actor William Holden walking through the French Quarter. As Holden does so, quote, "An aura of heightened reality moves with him, and all who fall within it feel it. A nearby tourist can only contrast Holden's resplendent reality with his own shadowy and precarious existence," end quote. And so Percy anticipates our own time, in which we are perhaps tempted to think that what is most real is what has been filmed or televised or viewed online most often. The dominance of media-generated images in the aesthetic sphere is also reflected in the effect of advertising in the novel. As you listen to this next quote, remember again that Binks's voice is complex. Even as he seems totally immersed in and accepting of his society, he also remains aware and ironic enough to critique it. One of the best examples of his doing both simultaneously is in this description of his experiences with automobiles when he takes his secretaries on dates. Quote, "When I first moved to Gentilly, I bought a new Dodge sedan, a red Ram 6. It was a comfortable, conservative, and economical two-door sedan. Just the thing, it seemed to me, for a young Gentilly businessman. When I first slid under the wheel to drive it, it seemed that everything was in order. Here was I, a healthy young man, a U.S. citizen driving a very good car. All these things were true enough. Yet on my first trip to the Gulf Coast with Marcia, I discovered to my dismay that my fine new Dodge was a regular incubator of malaise. Though it was comfortable enough, though it ran like a clock, though we went spinning along in perfect comfort and with a perfect view of the scenery, like the American couple in the Dodge ad, the malaise quickly became suffocating. We sat frozen in a gelid amiability. Our cheeks ached from smiling," end quote. Binks's experience in his prosperous post-war society generally mirrors his experience with the Dodge. Despite the promises of happiness and freedom offered by ads, he finds that most conversations seem to be, quote, "spoken by automatons who have no choice in what they say," end quote, i.e. they don't speak authentically. In such a world, Binks is happiest when he is alone, removing himself from his own life by engaging in modern aesthetic practices, watching the world as if it were filmed on camera, or studying it as though through a microscope, adopting, as Percy would call it elsewhere, the transcending posture of the scientist. This is the flip side of living as a mere organism in an environment, the intellectual stance appropriate to what Percy later called our age of theory and consumption. But Binks becomes aware that this mode of searching for meaning is finally insufficient. Quote, "The greatest success of this enterprise, which I call my vertical search, came one night when I sat in a hotel room in Birmingham and read a book called The Chemistry of Life. When I finished it, it seemed to me that the main goals of my search were reached, or were in principle reachable. Whereupon I went out and saw a movie called It Happened One Night, which was itself very good. A memorable night. The only difficulty was that though the universe had been disposed of, I myself was left over. There I lay in my hotel room with my search over, yet still obliged to draw one breath and then the next. But now I have undertaken a different kind of search, a horizontal search," end quote. With Binks's new search in the world, as opposed to above it, underway, what might he seek? Sensing the limitations of the aesthetic, might he seek the ethical sphere? Whatever distinct notions of the ethical Binks possesses arise primarily from Aunt Emily's speeches, where she grimly endorses an older code of behavior that owes a great deal not to Christianity, but to the Stoic ethics of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, whom Percy's own ancestors tended to conflate with General Robert E. Lee, the embodiment of Southern honor. Early in the novel, Aunt Emily implicitly echoes the romance of the lost cause, as she tells Binks that her ethos is doomed to pass away. "I no longer pretend to understand the world," she announces. "The things we hold dear are reviled and spat upon," end quote. The age that they are entering, she tells Binks, his age, the late 20th century, is the age of, quote, "the common man." And when I say common, I mean common as hell, end quote. She predicts its arrival as inevitable, but she cannot accept that her nephew is content to be one of the common men. Finally, she condemns Binks for his failure to live up to the doomed aristocratic ideals that previously characterized their family. Quote, this is Aunt Emily, quote, "I did my best for you, son. I gave you all I had. More than anything, I wanted to pass on to you the one heritage of the men of our family, a certain quality of spirit, a sense of duty, a nobility worn lightly, a sweetness, a gentleness with women. The only good things the South ever had, and the only things that really matter in this life. But how did it happen that none of this ever meant anything to you?" End quote. Aunt Emily's despairing sense of the decline of Southern, and on a larger scale, Western civilization is expressed in powerful romantic rhetoric and cannot but affect Binks. But it is ultimately fatalistic, defeatist, and Binks cannot accept it. And so Binks's church turns inevitably, albeit quietly, to the religious sphere. Now, religion, as Binks tells us at the end of the novel, quote, "is a peculiar word. It is something to be suspicious of," end quote. It is so for Binks in part because his society professes not atheism, but rather a superficial and complacent religiosity that is, in Percy's view, perhaps more deadly. Binks reports this phenomenon in language that wryly bespeaks his 1950s society's bland consensus. Quote, "As everyone knows, the polls report that 98% of Americans believe in God, and the remaining 2% are atheists and agnostics, which leaves not a single percentage point for a seeker," end quote. The novel, of course, depicts Binks himself becoming such a seeker, though he is never clearly a religious one. He generally seems unable to respond to Christianity at all, as he suggests in a journal entry where he notes his own invincible apathy on religious questions. Quote, "Here is the strangest fact of all," he writes. "Abraham saw signs of God and believed. Now the only sign is that all the signs in the world make no difference," end quote. Despite this, the progression of the novel does depend upon Binks's reading of the signs he encounters in his horizontal search, signs that can only be read by a pilgrim living in the world rather than an abstract mind transcending it via a microscope or a movie camera. These signs manifest themselves in the Eucharist, which is so vital to Binks's handicapped but devout cousin, Lonnie, whom our narrator is too ironic to sentimentalize, and most significantly, in the only authentic conversations Binks has in the novel, those with his troubled step-cousin, Kate. Then at the end of the novel comes the strangest sign of all, one that indirectly reflects on the shortcomings of Aunt Emily's ethics, and one that makes Binks explicitly ponder for the first time the real possibility of Christian faith. On Ash Wednesday, as Kate and Binks sit near his suburban home and discuss the possibility of their marriage, Binks watches an African-American man approach the doorway of a Catholic church, which in Louisiana at the time was newly stressing integration on a large scale. And Percy himself had entered the church under the direction of a group of Jesuits who led him to reject his inherited segregationist views, which Uncle Will had held very strongly. So the racial element here serves as rebuke to Aunt Emily's older Southern notion of the ethical, but on a more fundamental level, this man's action challenges Binks's commitment to the aesthetic. This particular African-American man, Binks tells us, acts, quote, more respectable than respectable. He is more middle class than one could believe, end quote. Acting as though his coming to this church in this neighborhood were nothing out of the ordinary. Accordingly, Binks is tempted to dismiss this man's church-going as mere nouveau bourgeois hypocrisy. But still, Binks sits in his car and waits and watches until the man comes outside of the church again. And this is Binks's description of the man. Quote, his forehead is an ambiguous sienna color. It is impossible to be sure that he received ashes. I watch him closely in the rearview mirror. It is impossible to say why he is here. Is it part and parcel of the complex business of coming up in the world? Mere status seeking? Or is it because he actually believes that God himself is present here in this church at the corner of Elysian Fields and Bon Enfant, two streets in New Orleans? Or is he here for both reasons? Through some dim, dazzling trick of grace, coming for the one and receiving the other as God's own insistent bonus? It is impossible to say, end quote. The question that Binks poses here might be rephrased. Is this man inauthentic, merely an organism in an environment, a complex animal jockeying for position in the socioeconomic jungle? Or is he authentic, a pilgrim in search of truth? Does his action signify? Like the ashes themselves, the answer remains ambiguous. But the scene somehow offers even the sardonic Binks hope. Hope that there is an order and a meaning in the world that goes beyond the limitations of Aunt Emily's fading social code. Hope that humans are capable of authentic seeking and action. Hope that the world itself might finally contain signs of divine love and grace. Binks tells us in the epilogue that, quote, as for my search, I have not the inclination to say much on the subject. Further, I naturally shy away from the subject of religion, which is, again, a peculiar word, something to be suspicious of, end quote. But it is clear that Binks has given up his life of self-centered convenience to marry the troubled Kate, and his search seems, if not quite over, then at least to have found a clear and hopeful new orientation. For in the epilogue, Percy leaves Binks and Kate with an understated hope in the possibility of living an authentic life that in outward respects may seem quite normal. But because for Percy their marriage is to be understood not as contract but as sacrament, it signifies something beyond the everyday and reveals that holiness which is to be found, as he wrote elsewhere, even in the ordinary, perhaps most especially in the ordinary. The moviegoer, then, is finally best understood in light of Percy's larger intellectual and spiritual interest. But let me close by considering it in relation to the work of a few other writers, fiction writers, as I consider not the overlap, but the tensions among three different labels one might legitimately apply to the novel: Southern, American, and Christian. As a subtly Christian novel engaged with the moral shortcomings of post-war American culture, The Moviegoer resembles another major novel of the early 1960s, John Updike's Rabbit Run. And Updike, who was a professing Protestant Christian, read many of the same philosophers and theologians that Percy did, Updike having a particular interest in Kierkegaard. But Percy's strong Southern heritage adds a third dimension to his work, which Updike's lacks. Because the moviegoer prominently features at least one character, Aunt Emily, who speaks for the fading values of a particular regional past which is not generically American. Updike writes in Pennsylvania. Let's see. In that regard, the moviegoer somewhat resembles the work of earlier Southern writers. But Percy's novel represents a new kind of Southern fiction, both in its post-1945 setting, in which the South seems less and less distinctive, and most importantly, in its crucial Christian underpinnings. One thing that's Christian about the moviegoer, which I haven't yet stressed, the novel is definitively a comedy, in that it culminates with a marriage, a happy ending, just as the Gospels and Dante's Divine Comedy do. And Binks's comic rather than tragic end clearly distinguishes him from the like of William Faulkner's best-known protagonist, Quentin Compson, of The Sound and the Fury and Absalom, Absalom. As Percy himself noted on more than one occasion, he wanted to write about a Quentin who did not commit suicide. Faulkner's Quentin commits suicide, Percy's Binks will not. While Faulkner's hero found himself haunted and finally tragically overwhelmed by a whole barracks of, quote, garrulous, outraged, baffled ghosts from the Southern past, that's Absalom, Absalom, Binks was granted the grace to overcome such ghosts, or saw them vanquished by time itself, like Aunt Emily's necessarily limited vision of honor. Like his fellow Southern Catholic Flannery O'Connor, then, Percy explicitly broke with the mode of memory that characterized earlier 20th century Southern writers and embraced instead a mode of revelation, one that went hand in hand with an apocalyptic sense, a sense that a world had ended, but also that a new creation was ever at hand. And so, rather than writing a literature which revealed the continual impact of the past on the present, a literature of the historical imagination, Percy and O'Connor alike wrote primarily about the possibilities of life in the here and now. In doing so, Percy found a way to reveal depths of mystery and meaning in the lives of characters living in a new South of shopping malls, golf courses, and interstates. That has been his gift to readers from this region, including me, for while I can still recognize aspects of the world that Faulkner and Warren and Porter wrote about, no writer has captured the South that I grew up in as well as Percy did. And as I hope I've demonstrated, his intellectual and religious interests were not merely incidental, but essential to his success in doing so, in simply telling the truth through fiction about the here and now in which he found himself, the here and now in which he believed God is both hidden and subtly present, and, in literature at least, best approached by means of cunning and stealth. Thank you.